Hello, I'm Sasan with Proteus Debate Academy. We give high-quality coaching resources for competitors and coaches in high school and college and whatever other kind of debate that you are interested in. That feels like a boring intro. Feels like I should be like, "What up, fish monsters?" It's because that's Proteus's weird lion mermaid man. Great. I'm gonna do an analysis video. The last one we posted, I recorded yesterday evening. Now I got no judging. I might have to interrupt this round to judge because it's still that weekend and I'm still judging a middle school state championship. I got some snacks. I have some tea. I'm ready to go. So we got our handy dandy. Whoa. Oh, it's because I'm not. Boom. Okay. Where is it? Here we go. Our spreadsheet, as you can see, nothing's been added because nobody's requested anything yet. But let's roll the dice. Random number between 1 and 45. Why didn't it do it last time? Whatever, 39. Okay. Saratoga RS versus Ravenwood BJ. This was requested because there's a lot of controversy over the decision and ultimately came down to different debate philosophies and who adapted. If you could do a round analysis, that would be amazing. I hope it would. Let's... I can roast Dick Fred because he was our first subscriber, if I recall. Alright, yeah, let's do it. I put all this food in front of me, and now it's difficult for me to type. Oh, that's just the letter V. I'm guessing it's this. I'm guessing it's this. Oh, I need like headphones, don't I? Alright. Oh, they're already plugged in even. Okay. Alright. Okay. Let's hope the affirmative goes first or else I will be lost. Okay. Do a sound test. Sounds wonderful. Sounds brilliant. Okay. Let's get this antique on the road show.
Saratoga firms are so
great. I hate this.
In the status quo, the United States is pulled.
Okay, I don't know the topic. Does it say in the chat? Nope, it does not say. And they just go straight into the topic. Okay, I don't want to see the results. I'll figure this out based on context clues. Okay, sole contention. Bold. Let's go for it.
Everyone's good, right? Saratoga firms are sole contention is the new frontier battle. In the status quo, the United States has pulled ground troops out of much of the Middle East and Syria. Tragically, however, the New York Times finds last month that these conditions have left a power vacuum in the region, spelling the perfect storm for an ISIS resurgence.
Remember ISIS? That was like a big deal for a minute.
Thankfully, there is a solution. Offensive cyber operations. Rudsell finds in 2018 that in lieu of more traditional approaches to terror, the Trump administration has authorized the DoD to use offensive operations against global terrorist organizations, which have been crucial in reducing terrorism worldwide. After the recent pull-out of ground troops, now is more important than ever to continue cyber operations. Currently, African governments are attempting to develop OCOs in counter-terror efforts as regional terror organizations have used the cyberspace to organize attacks and recruit. Thankfully, Ogunlala finds in 2019 that the United States has aided African nations by deploying these OCOs through technology transfers, information sharing, and training. He furthers that these OCOs deployed in Africa by the United States is what will help African nations give them what they need to combat terror groups in the long run. Additionally, this cooperation also materializes in more effective drone strikes, as Ackerman 19 explains that current drones are so imprecise that for every one terrorist targeted, 28 civilians are killed. Fortunately, Braille finds in 2019
Why doesn't
that
space
cyber drones
work?
are 85% more accurate because they're out.
We're going to look up the topic. Public forum topics. Clearly something to do with cybersecurity. 2019. Probably spring 2019. Which means it would be even older. Oh, okay. Great. Or could be from... Nah, it's probably from a while back. But let's just look. Okay. Oh, no, here we go. The benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cyber operations, OCOs, outweighs the harms. Offensive cyber operations. I think this reminds me of like the college LD topic of like 3 years ago. Okay. Great. OCOs.
Algorithms are able to detect real-time locations of terrorists. Thus, Solmar finds that OCOs and drones reduce civilian casualties, which prevent the exacerbation of anti-American sentiment in these countries. These technologies are key as terrorism has severely destabilized Africa. Herbert and Kopp find in 2018 that Boko Haram killed almost 35,000 people and displaced millions, plunging 3/4 of the country into poverty and putting 5.2 million at the risk of death by starvation. Worse, because of the low cost and convenience of cyber warfare, Beta 19 finds that terrorists are shifting online for recruitment, funding, and attack planning. Fortunately, Vavra 19 finds that the United States OCOs can take out terrorists on a cyber level. Empirics proof is the 2017 U.S. cyber attack on ISIS halted their entire digital campaign, along with their recruitment capacity, which took years to rebuild. In addition to targeting recruitment bases, these cyber attacks are particularly effective in taking out terrorist funding. Kalamachi 19 explains that ISIS has diversified its portfolio to the point where traditional operations are not sufficient to take out its funding. Fortunately, Sales 19 explains that cyber operations have been used to freeze terrorist assets, and Rogers concludes this led to a decline in terrorist funding worldwide. Continuing this will be key, as Charlton finds that ISIS has been attempting to recruit expert hackers to infiltrate Western networks, which Dogman finds would likely materialize through an attack on U.S. power grids. This would be devastating, as Prime 15 finds that such an attack would cause a nationwide blackout for a year and kill around 10 million people from starvation. Overall, Vavra furthers that the United States is poised to rely much more heavily on offensive cyber operations to control and combat terror groups, which would help reduce terrorism worldwide. This is crucial for 3 specific reasons. First, to reduce immediate deaths. Mitigating terror is crucial, as Dudley finds in 2018 that in 1 year alone, terror groups killed almost 20,000 people, and this does not account for deaths by the instability they cause. For example, the Syrian civil war was exacerbated by ISIS, killing 500,000 people. Second is to spur economic growth. Jonas 19 finds that an increase in terrorism decreases FDI by 32.9% because investors see countries as poor investments with heightened terrorism because of the risk of political instability associated with it. Moreover, Ross 19 finds the purely psychological impacts of terrorism deter FDI from entering these nations. Thus, even if OCOs don't succeed in stopping terrorism, an increase in counterterrorism spending, compounded with increased cooperation with the United States, gives investors the perceptual confidence they need to increase investment. This is crucial, as Tintin 17 finds a 10% increase in FDI can increase GDP by 3.9% for every concurrent year. Overall, fueling investment into Africa is crucial to help globalize their economy. Indeed, Songway finds that it's just a 7% increase in GDP for Africa can leapfrog them into the development cycle, lifting 400 million people out of poverty. Third is to ensure political stability. Puke 19 finds that terrorist groups have rigged elections in African countries, fueling political instability. Through decreasing terrorism in general would also solve this. Chak 19 explains OCO specifically can protect elections in developing countries, and Vavra 19 finds that the United States has the tools necessary to help. Protecting democratic elections is important for 2 reasons. First, Hagrid 14 finds democratic institutions are less prone to conflict as their leaders are more rational, and second, democratic institutions have more economic growth because investors see a politically stable country as a better investment. Thank you. Please affirm.
Usually I stop a lot during the constructives and share a lot of thoughts. And I didn't do this here, not because I was just lost in the sauce of that cup noodle, but because it was pretty good. Really great impacts. Gonna be damn hard to outweigh. Unless, it's a big impact topic, right? You're talking about, like, war, and I don't know if they didn't go for nukes, so will the other side, who knows. But I thought the impact framing was really good. I thought the scenarios that they're talking about are really solid. The major problem with this case, problem's a strong word, it's a great case, It's a good case. It's a great case. I don't know. Like, it's like given the context of the, like, constructives that I've seen in these rounds that I've judged, this might be the best one. It's the best I recall. Okay. The link scenarios are vague, right? Like, I don't know what an OCO is. Like, I know what OCOs are, but I don't know what the OCO that protects election security is, right? Like, and the cards aren't talking about the same things, right? It's like your cards don't just generically refer to OCOs and have generic links to the stuff they're talking about. It might be a study about OCOs, but like the part where they're talking about election security is specific. That creates a problem because people will draw connections all the time. It happened in the other round analysis I did, right, where they're like, oh, okay, like this author says that OCOs can be cheap, and then this side says that they stop election hacking. But there's no way of... It's like saying cars can be cheap and cars can drive at 200 miles an hour. Like, that's not talking about the same car, most likely. Or maybe it is. We don't know. I think being more specific about what your OCO, like, link into that impact would be great, unless your evidence isn't actually good. Unless it's not actually talking about the kind of OCO that your other cards are talking about. All that said, I thought it was pretty good. Let's see what the negation has in store for us.
Can I see one thing that...
Everyone should share their cases. Also, high school, apparently even an LD, doesn't know about... And now I'm forgetting the term, because the forensic season is over, so I just went blank. What's the thing? Speech Drop. SpeechDrop.net. Check it out. It's great. Maybe they're discouraged from using the internet or something, but SpeechDrop.net. Way better than email chains or flash drives or anything else. It's a really weird way to hold a cup. I recognize. Okay.
Rohan 98%. The benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cyber operations outweigh the harms. Our sole contention is preventing...
What? 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 It's 5:20.
Thankfully, there's a solution. Here, which is the new frontier battle. In the status quo,
Saratoga affirms. Okay. Saratoga affirms the... Oh! I thought that he was like... I thought that was like colon. Like, we negate colon. This thing is... Alright, I'm dumb. Clearly, it's just early. Okay.
Economic catastrophe. Financial institutions across the world are under attack. Moon 19 of Reuters writes that state-sponsored hacks on banks have rapidly increased, with Iran, China, and Russia conducting 23 attacks. These attacks are starting to leave a dent. Walters 19 of the Heritage Foundation writes that cyber intrusions will cost the global economy $2.1 trillion by the end of the year, more than quadrupling the 2015 total. The U.S.'s use of offensive cyber operations is at the heart of economic warfare for two reasons. First is through prompting retaliation. Delaney and 19 of NBC writes that Trump, empowered by Congress, has conducted more offensive operations in his first 2 years than in Obama's entire presidency. Other countries have taken note. Valeriano, 19 of Cato, writes that Trump has completely distorted cyberspace, catalyzing fear and a cycle of escalation where even the smallest intrusion could be interpreted as a national threat. Retaliating against the U.S. is feasible, as Denelli, 19 of Roll Call, establishes that U.S. computers are relatively defenseless in the case of an attack. This has already happened. Jin, 19 of Yale, writes that immediately after the U.S. hacked Iran's military, they retaliated with a cyber attack on 46 different banks, causing millions of dollars in damage. Critically, this was not the case before the U.S. began to use offensive operations. Valeriano continues that before 2016, when Obama imposed regulations limiting offensive operations, other states rarely retaliated. Second is through shattering cooperation. Yannick 16, the AF Institute, explains that the U.S. has ramped up its cyber cooperation, signing an agreement with Russia, Europe, and India.
Okay, so real
Despite
quick.
this.
This argument's not bad. There's a couple concerns that may play out later in the round. The first is like the negative solvency, right? Which isn't technically a thing that the negative needs to demonstrate this round, but I'll just talk about it, right? Yes, let's say we buy the story that this is escalated because of the United States doing things, right? But to assume that the United States no longer being aggressive will make all of these other organizations also back down without direct evidence that says the United States, de-escalating will lead to de-escalation from the other sides is a logical fallacy called denying the antecedent, right? Where you're like, A leads to B, and that means that if we don't do A, B doesn't happen. There's other factors at play, right? We don't know that only A leads to B. Or it could just be too late, right? Maybe you can't just reverse it, right? Like hitting a tree with an axe chops it down, but it's not like you could do something in the reverse direction with an axe to put the tree back the way it was. With that said, that's not what the topic is asking, right? The topic is not saying the United States federal government should maintain offensive cyber attacks or whatever operations. And so the negative doesn't have to defend like what would happen if we negated. They just have to show that it does harm. But the other issue that comes from that is the tense of the topic, which is important, right? A topic can say would do more harm than good or will do more harm than good. That's a future tense. It could do has done more harm than good or did do more harm than good. That's a past tense. Or it could say does more harm than good or is doing more harm than good. And that is a present tense. And the tenses of these topics matter because they set the bounds for what's topical. So, if I'm the AF, I'm going to argue that, maybe Trump-era stuff isn't long enough ago that I can easily hand-wave it. But basically the idea that, the threats that are currently in the space were a result of U.S. actions could be made irrelevant because you could argue like, hey, like the question isn't where did the threats come from and whose fault it is. The question is, given that these threats exist and they do, what is the best thing we can do from here? Which the negative still has grounds to argue that isn't increasing or maintaining offensive cyber operations, but they at least now need evidence that shows decreasing offensive cyber operations will de-escalate. And I haven't heard that yet. And the question I would ask in Cross-X is, can you read me the part in any of your cards that says decreasing cyber operations will decrease cyber threats from other places? Maybe they have that card. My bet is they don't. And they're going to come up and they're going to try to, squirrel their way out of that question. But it's fine. I have it on record that they don't have that. I don't care what their answer is. I just want to later be able to say they don't actually have this card. And the reason I do that in Cross-X is so that they don't then spend 4 or 5 minutes searching for a card that does say that in their file somewhere, knowing the significance it's going to play in the round. Okay, let's continue.
Louis 15, the CSIS, explains that high levels of political distrust have gutted efforts, causing countries to suspect that agreements will not be adhered to. The reason comes from Valeriano, who continues that the Trump administration violates norms of restraint and has changed the rules of the global game of cyberspace to a more aggressive posture. When the United States, a global hegemon and norm setter, announces to the world that offensive hacking is encouraged, the first domino gets pushed over. For example, Moore 17 of Global Studies writes that our hack in Iran served as a global wake-up call for nations to put their hat into the cyber realm, with Britain, India, China, and other countries having no choice but to invest into cyberspace. Wan Sheng 19 of PDO puts it simply: the US has directly triggered a global cyber arms race, causing a spiral of serious threats and risks to security. As the world engages in an arms race, no country has enough trust to form agreements. Nations are less likely to agree to limit their own abilities if they cannot guarantee.
Is this just like a generic arms race evidence?
Goldsmith 11 of the Hoover Institute explains that no international agreement can be effective unless the United States clamps down on its own capabilities. He thus concludes that we aren't going to get restraint from our adversaries until we restrain ourselves. For example, Strobel 19 of the Wall Street Journal writes that although the US signed an agreement with China to end economic hacking, China has been violating it for the past 18 months. International cooperation is critical, as Marr 18 of Carnegie writes that an agreement led by major economies to limit economic attacks sends a clear message to halt the intrusions. Both of these reasons are bound to cause a major cyber hack on financial institutions and would devastate the impoverished around the world. Kasani 18 of CNBC writes that even a single bank can be systemically important, and due to global economic linkages, one hack could cause a ripple effect that devastates services across the world, leading to the next financial crisis. Overall, the IMF quantifies that the next major economic shock will push 900 million people into poverty. Thus, we are so very proud to meet you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Personally, I'm not a very, like, I don't know how to, there's a term for it, a war hawk. So I'm not trying to be like, oh yeah, just whatever, you know, like, let's just get the U.S. military and might makes right and do whatever we want. But the negative hasn't demonstrated that de-escalation solves. They've demonstrated that escalation escalates from our opponents, like cyber operations lead to retaliation and escalation. But they don't actually have any evidence that says de-escalation on our end de-escalates other places, right? And I don't know. I think people have an overly simplistic view of the whole, like, retaliation thing, right? Like, I think if your opinion is that terrorists and extremists would have no motivation to attack anyone if not for the United States involvement somewhere in something, I think you have a lot of valid points, but probably an overly simplified view of what the motivation for extremist attacks are, right? Like, I think it's a little infantilizing to be like, the only reason anyone does anything is because they're upset about this one thing that we did. You know, they have their own lives and their own politics and their own motivations to take action. That's not to wash our hands of it, but again, I just think that leaves a plausible hole in the story where the United States de-escalates, but other countries are like, we already have all of this offensive cyber capability, we're going to stay aggressive. Or, you know, other actors, not necessarily countries. So there's that issue with the argument. The other issue with the argument, I had another thing in mind, but I guess let's talk about the impacts. They're fine, but I remember the other thing I had in mind. The impacts are fine. They are vague. and they just don't seem like they outweigh, right? Like, they have some vague linkage to some sort of massive international whatever, but it's just not as well written out and quantified as the affirmatives impact. So I think they're going to have a hard time winning the impact game. The thing that I was going to say is that, cyber threats are a real thing. This was in 2019, it's 2021, and there's been cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure that have cost lives and driven up gas prices and messed with pipelines and stuff like that. And so this is real. The thing, though, is, like, most topics are real. Like, I see this on the debate subreddit, where every now and then someone will, like, post the link, and they'll be like, whoa, like, you guys remember, like, the LD topic from 4 years ago? Like, this thing is real, look. And it's like, yeah, why do you think that was the topic? Like, they don't just pick untrue, random things. And if your research ability is good and your arguments are sound, then yeah, you're describing plausible things that will happen. Like, what else would happen? I think that says a lot about your research and strategy and ethics as a debater when you're advocating that something is likely to happen, but then you are just floored when it actually happens. And also probably speaks to a lack of, exportable skills, or at least limited value to an activity we do, if we're not actually discussing things that are of exigent importance and could happen. So what am I looking for in CrossX? I am looking for the affirmative team to establish the sort of lack of solvency or lack of, like, de-escalation method coming from the negative. Maybe establish something about the tense of the topic, right? Like, focusing on, like, it's what we're doing right now. So a question of, like, would we be better off if we stopped right now, or if we kept doing this right now, or increased it right now? That's how I would frame it if I was the affirmative. I don't know that I could get out of that framing if I was the negative. So the negative probably needed stronger impacts and clearer link stories, because their hands are sort of more tied by the resolution. Let's see. Oh my lord.
Yeah. So the top of your... Everyone good? Okay. So at the top of your case, you tell me that U.S. cyber operations are going to prompt retaliatory attacks.
Yep.
Countries are only going to retaliate if they're certain of who they're attacking, or if they've attacked them previously, right?
Like, we'd say that could factor into their analysis. Well, we'd say, like, a majority of the time, if you look to what's happened in the past, retaliation has happened when the U.S. has done cyber attacks.
Yes, but that's only when they're certain the United States is doing it, correct?
No.
So they're just blindly attacking the United States?
If they think the U.S. has done it, then they're going to retaliate. That's the question.
Okay, so what does they think the United States mean?
If they have, I'd say, they don't have to be, 100% certain that it was the United States, but there's a pretty good probability that that's the case. There's a pretty high probability that.
So what defines that probability?
The fact that they're already mad at the United States. They're already retaliating against the United States. I mean, I guess that hurts your solvency if you're like, yeah, but anybody attacking would mean that they attacked the United States. So that could be a hole you're digging for yourself. But yeah, I mean, I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the defense is out with this question. It's to demonstrate that it's already happening in the status quo. Whatever mechanism is happening now, that's what we are talking about happening in the future.
I'm not one of these actors. I don't know the exact strategic calculus that happens in their mind, but I'd say for the most part, if they think that the U.S. is doing these attacks, which the U.S. has shown a propensity to do in the past, it's pretty likely that they do it in the future. They retaliate as well. Okay, so on the top of your contention, do you make the argument that offensive operations are an alternative to drone strikes?
No, we say that offensive operations enhance drone strikes.
Okay, so you're saying that drone strikes increase as a result, or?
No, we're simply saying they become more accurate, meaning they kill fewer civilians,
so
not propagating
should
anti-American sentiment while still
okay.
killing terrorists.
Should casualties from drone strikes have gone down, like, with an increased use of offensive operations in, like, Trump's campaign? Or, like, Trump's
Great
presidency?
question.
Well, yeah, sure. That's
Okay,
what evidence
have
indicates.
casualties gone down as a result?
Our evidence indicates that drone strikes have become more accurate.
Compared to Obama's presidency, we contend that, like, the number of casualties from drone strikes
Sure.
has
Yeah, but that's
doubled,
a
so way
number.
more than,
Sure,
like,
but
anything
what's
in Obama's
okay?
presidency.
Sure, but what's critical is
Yeah.
how many casualties per drone strike.
I mean,
right? It's not a matter of just one,
you'd have to
it's
win a
matter of-
link. Okay, but here's the problem with the AF's argument. You'd have to win the perception link that people are going to be less angry at the United States because they're like, you know what? But a smaller percentage of us per strike have been dying. Like, an increasing number of my relatives have been bombed, but when you really think about it, it's pennies to the dollar for how many terrorists they're killing, which probably is not how people perceive it. Let's see if the negative latches onto that.
Well, how frequent?
But you just said that it's the same number, just as more efficient like drone strikes, right? So, like, is it more drone strikes, or is it just, like, better drones? Like, I'm so confused as to what your link is here.
Okay, so are you going to argue that drone strikes have increased? Or?
I don't know, like, what's your link? I just want to respond to it.
We're just saying it makes drone strikes better. Whether that means that drone strikes have increased is irrelevant to the argument.
But you just said it's, like, per drone strike or something. So
It's not irrelevant
just
to
saying,
the
so are drone
argument
strikes
because
increased?
if I mean, at best, it's just a no link, right? Like, it doesn't matter if they're more accurate if the people in these scenarios are never going to experience, hey, fewer of us are dying, we're less mad at the United States. So, yeah, I think that's a good takeout of that argument if the negative team, knows how to go for it.
Sure.
Oh, okay. Well, we can talk
Seems
about
like maybe they're not seeing
So,
that.
on your case, you talk about a cyber arms race.
Yeah.
Why did the United States develop cyber arms?
We'd say there's, a bunch of different reasons. Like, they want to just, develop, an increased capacity.
But
to,
why did they want to?
You obviously have an answer.
Because Russia had it first. So,
Well,
even
I'd
if the
say
United
that
States
the
doesn't
US
develop it, a still very powerful country
can I
like
respond to
your
that real
warring
quick?
days developed these
Can I
arms.
respond to that real quick?
Go.
Yeah. I'd say, the main thing is, even if Russia had some sort of cyber capabilities in the past, the U.S., the rate at which they developed is, a lot bigger, a lot quicker than, what Russia's rate of development was, which is why they're the ones who are triggering the cyber arms race with
Wait,
all countries around
that's
the
not
world.
what your argument is. Your argument is that the presence of a strong government or military power having these arms races or having these arms
Sure, but
leads
we
to
said-
other countries developing these arms.
Yeah, and we
doesn't
say
that
the
still
U.S.
happen
The
with
U.S.
Russia?
specifically. No, we say the U.S. specifically.
So why doesn't that happen with
greatest
Russia?
degree.
But you're
They
saying
happen
it did,
first.
and that's what brought the
That's
United
what
States
Russia
in.
did.
Well, I guess you're not saying it, but they're saying it did. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is, in so many words, the challenge to the denying the antecedent logic, right? Where they're now saying, hey, so you're saying by the United States dropping out an arms race doesn't happen, and they're saying, right, but you can't really support that with the evidence, especially since other people are in the arms race, could be a part of the arms race. You don't get the fiat that everyone stops, right? So yeah, I mean, I think the negative has a great argument on the drone strikes, has a potential great argument on the drone strikes. I don't think they've seen it yet or know how to convey it. Maybe the second speaker does, but I don't think that really takes out that much of the affirmative's impact. And I think comparatively, the negative is going to have a much harder time explaining away that the arms race is non-unique in a world where other countries and other actors have offensive cyber operations incentivizing people to whatever. I don't think that they won't know it was the United States argument is good. I mean, maybe it's fine if you're going to make 3 responses to a contention. Sure, that can be one of them. I just hope that they don't go very hard for that, because it's not because the links have been tested, as I'm always saying in these videos, right? Like, we've done cyber operations, and they've retaliated against us. So they have some way of knowing who to attack, and there's no reason to assume that that would stop, because the AF isn't proposing a policy, right? Like, the AF's defending the status quo. Like, you're defending just regular cyber operations, the way they've been going, and how they're trending, and those seem to have garnered retaliation. So there doesn't seem to be any problem with that argument. So with everything said, I think right now, if I'm the judge, trending towards the affirmative. And honestly, like, I usually make my decision by the second speeches, like the second speaker speeches, and then it's up to the debaters to, like, say the right thing or not say the right thing, and maybe my decision will change. But once all the arguments are introduced, all the pieces are in play, I'll know what the best moves are in my mind and which side has the advantage. Then it just becomes a question of watching them play that out and seeing if they play out the game strategically and effectively. Sort of like how when you're playing chess online, the chess engine will tell you, you know, you have like a 70% chance to win. Because it assumes if people do the optimal things from that state of play forward, then this side's probably going to win. Doesn't guarantee that they will make the optimal moves.
Winning. And when I go to their case, I'm going to be starting. Are you ready? 4 weighing mechanisms. First is uniqueness. There are a lot of other reasons why cyber attacks can cause economic collapse or cause banks to go. What our Hubbard evidence indicates is the U.S. has pulled out troops right now, which means the only way you counter terrorism in the status quo is through offensive cyber operations, which means we're always outweighing on uniqueness. Second, and more importantly, is time frame. Terror is happening right now. It's the most probable impact. Offensive cyber operations have happened for the last 10 years. We've never seen a huge recession due to a banking crisis they talk about. So you prefer us on time frame because it's happening right now is the most probable. But you also prefer us because it's intergenerational. Even if a recession happens, countries fundamentally recover from recessions. They always have good times of economic growth.
Let's take this one at a time, because it seems like a lot of jargon that people, not saying it's not impressive, but I think people will be kind of like, I don't know, really impressed by, and I guess let's break it down. So the rebuttal speech here is framed under 4 weighing mechanisms. Nothing wrong with that. It probably indicates that you have good round vision and that you're thinking about what your win scenarios are at the end of the round. And you're trying to pave some paths towards that right now, and you're going to hopefully pick 1, maybe 2 of them to go for in the final focus. That's fine. The first is uniqueness. Uniqueness isn't a weighing mechanism. Uniqueness describes the status quo. Now, what's probably happening here is that we're using uniqueness as a shorthand for basically the desirability of the status quo. So, in other words, what if they show that the status quo is bad? I mean, nobody's proposing a policy, but I think so. It doesn't exactly work like a try or die scenario normally would, right? But yeah, what's being argued here is like, look, if we can indicate that in the status quo, terrorism is going to be a significant threat and offensive cyber operations are unique to stopping them, then we'll win. That's what the first framing of like uniqueness is talking about. So let's take a look at the justifications under that.
First is uniqueness. There are a lot of other reasons why cyber attacks can cause economic collapse or cause banks to go.
Oh, I think that he's also using uniqueness, or maybe this is actually what he's doing, is talking about like which side's arguments are most unique to the topic. Like as in like not non-unique.
first is uniqueness. There are a lot of other reasons why cyber attacks can cause economic collapse or cause banks to go.
There's lots of other reasons why cyber attacks can cause economic collapse.
First is uniqueness. There are a lot of other reasons why cyber attacks can cause economic collapse or cause banks to go.
Vagueness to go?
The U.S. has pulled out troops right now, which means the only way you counter terrorism in the status quo is through offensive cyber operations, which means we're always at.
What? The only way you have terrorism in the status quo is through offensive cyber operations?
Are you ready? 4 weighing mechanisms. First is uniqueness. There are a lot of other reasons why cyber attacks can cause economic collapse or cause banks to go. What our Hubbard evidence indicates is the U.S. has pulled out troops right now, which is the only way you counter terrorism.
The only way you counter terrorism in the status quo is through offensive cyber operations. Okay, the bit in the beginning still doesn't make sense to me, but sure. That's indicating what I was saying earlier about the status quo. Great. Outweighing on uniqueness again isn't a thing.
This time frame, terror is happening right now. It's the most probable impact. Offensive cyber.
Terrorism is happening right now, but the clash is over what way reduces it best, right? Like the same terrorism that you're talking about is the impact of the negative. They're just arguing that the method it's a methods debate, right? Like the method of decreasing terrorism that works the best is de-escalation because the motivation for that terrorism is retaliatory. So just using the fact that the terrorism exists as a reason to vote for the affirmative isn't really disrupting the narrative of the negation at all, because they're also arguing that terrorism exists and claiming that as their impact. It's just they have a different method of solving for it.
Appropriations have happened for the last 10 years. We've never seen a huge recession due to a bank crisis like talked about. So you prefer us on time frame because it's happening. Second, more importantly, is time frame. Terror is happening right now. It's the most probable impact. Offensive cyber operations have happened for the last 10 years. We've never seen a huge recession due to a bank crisis.
Then why do the offensive cyber operations? Don't you say in your case that you're conducting these cyber operations because there is an increasing trend for ISIS to recruit? Was that the negative, or you just like, they're not cyber, but we are, and so we need to, like, cyber attack their something? Again, it would help for you to tell me what your actual cyber operations that you're defending are. But, again, like, I don't think this is, like, unique to the negative that you're talking about, like, the threats to, let alone, I don't think the argument that, like, cyber attacks have been going on for like a few years, so, but like we haven't seen like the world end yet, so like that means it's not going to happen. Like, it's not good policy making, right? Like, well, I haven't died in a car crash yet, so I guess I won't wear a seatbelt. Like, it's not, maybe it's not winning the time frame argument, but it has a pretty, time frame is going to have a pretty hard time outweighing it, because in many regular decisions we make in everyday life, we take precautions toward things that have not yet happened.
On time frame because it's happening right now. It's the most probable, which you also prefers because it's intergenerational. Even if a recession happens, countries fundamentally recover from recessions. They always have good times of economic growth. The problem is terrorism is an intergenerational impact. It affects the structure of these economies because they can't generate any economic investment, so they're not in the developing cycle. That's always why terrorism comes first. Third, the people in developing countries that are affected by terrorism don't have advocates, whereas the people in these other countries do. Like in Iran and Russia, they always have negotiation powers. The countries always.
Do you have evidence that says that countries that have terrorism never have any, like, I mean, I guess you're trying to extend what was read in the first argument, but like, the United States has terrorism. I don't know, I guess it was 2019, so like that might have been a controversial statement there, but I mean, the United States had lynchings going back hundreds of years. That didn't stop people from investing in Georgia or wherever. Not to throw Georgia under the... I'm sure Georgia wasn't the, you know, the at the heart of all that stuff. But, yeah, no, I don't know. I think it has a very, like, narrow view of terrorism, one, and two, I don't know. I think it's, like, the framing is taking a lot of stuff for granted. Also, you're not actually, like, responding to any of the negatives links. You're just already trying to outweigh, which seems a little early. I mean, like, establishing that weighing mechanism is fine, but so far the only things I've heard is, hey, even if the entire negative is true, we still win, which seems early to be talking about the entire negative being true.
Always for the people who don't have any incentive to negotiate, because there's no political stability in the region, which is why you're not going to see any alternative solvency for our harms. Fourth is a prereq. If there's no stability in the region,
like India doesn't have terror attacks, like that. It's where all of the foreign investment, not all of it, a lot of it's gone. Like, I don't know. I'd like to hear an example, have that expounded upon a little.
Solvency for our harms. Fourth is a prereq. If there's no stability in the region, conflict becomes much more likely. Recessions become much more likely in times of conflict because countries are so focused on, like...
This also assumes that drone strikes create stability, which... What's your like, where has that link been tested? Like, that's something that I want to hear asked in, cross-examination. Like, hey, can you give me an example of a place that got drone striked into stability? Like, oh yeah, no, there used to be problems, but we did a lot of drone strikes, and now it's a great place to invest. Like, has that happened before? Not sure that it has. I think there's also a similar problem of, like, denying the antecedent happening on the affirmative, where they're saying, well, instability and terrorism has made these countries not a great place to invest. But then they're just, like, taking a part of that argument out, like, oh, well, this thing won't increase anymore, and then, therefore, it's now a great place to invest, and it's stable, because there aren't problems. And I just can't think of where this has happened before, especially since they're advocating for such a narrow interpretation of, like, terrorism, right? So now you have fewer instances of places you can compare it to and say, oh, here was an unstable place where after this conflict or after this whatever has actually become a great place to invest in a fast-growing economy. But because you have chosen such a narrow interpretation of terrorism, you now have fewer instances that you can point to that demonstrate the propensity for your advocacy to solve the way you say it will.
Rather than their economy. Now let's go to their case on the impact level. They read two cards at the bottom. One that says a cyber operation will lead to bank collapse, and one that says recession causes 900 million people. Their bank's evidence never says the word recession in it. Call for it. They don't have an internal link to recession. Don't let them read a new link in second rebuttal or later. Then, more importantly, their IMF evidence about 900 million people going to poverty talks about a recession like the 2008 recession, where the U.S. had high economic growth and then collapsed. There's not high economic growth right now, which means they don't get access to the $900 million evidence. You're mitigating that.
There was not high economic growth in November of 2019. Yeah, and also you're now reading evidence for what you're saying. Like, you're making up a reason why this comparison doesn't work. I don't know. Not very strong.
The development cycle of Africa's economy when you decrease terrorism because you allow more investment to come in. The U.S. will always recover because they always have an opportunity to get stimulus packages, whereas Africa will simply never not. Let's go down to the top of their case. They have two links. The first is about retaliation. Oh, sorry. Group their links. Realize this is all dependent on defense, because if we have better defense, it makes it more likely that we take out their impact.
If you have
3 reasons why offense helps.
Better defense. Are we talking about in debate terms or like against attacks?
Because if we have better defense, it makes it more likely that we take out their impact. 3 reasons why offense...
We're talking about
first,
literal, like, cyber offense, cyber defense.
Defense, if you take out another person's systems, like if your offensive capabilities are able to take out an opponent's offensive capabilities, then you simply don't need defense, and you mitigate the risk that your like power grids or your banks are attacked. Second, you're able to find vulnerabilities in your own defensive systems with an increased use of offensive cyber operations, which means you're able to patch those vulnerabilities, which means when you have increased offensive cyber operations, you have better defensive systems, which means it's less likely or it mitigates their impact. Third is on scope. Offense allows you to take out the conventional capabilities of other countries, whereas defense only allows you to take out the cyber capabilities of other countries. For example, offensive operations can take out the military compounds by hacking the software there, but defense capabilities can only interact with attacks that happen to them. Tough shelf responses. There are 2 links that are dependent on proliferation of nuclear weapons, but there's 2 reasons why proliferation would happen in either world. The first is the resolution of...
What are you reading? You're reading answers to arguments they didn't read, which... to me indicates that you weren't listening that carefully. I'm not even flowing, and I'm listening, and I know that their arguments are not dependent on nuclear proliferation. But that's, I guess, the block you had ready.
Question of use and not development, which means development would have happened in either world, triggering their incentive. And second, more importantly, other countries will always have an incentive to proliferate these nuclear weapons for 2 reasons. A, even if these countries always want an inherent upper hand, like Ashwin tells you in Cross, and more importantly, Russia developed these cyber capabilities before the U.S. did, which means other countries would have still developed cyber capabilities. On the link about retaliation. 7 reasons why retaliation isn't true. First, anonymity. States cannot determine who's responsible and therefore don't know what to retaliate against. The conflict just dies down and no escalation can take place. It's Erica 15 finds that in the past, there's been no escalation unless people are able to pinpoint cyber attacks. Second is delay times. Even if they do decipher it, it just takes too long. Bogart 19 finds the country loses justification.
Arguing the card that says there's no retaliation unless they can pinpoint cyber attacks is not saying there's no retaliation. It's saying retaliation happens when they can pinpoint cyber attacks. Your card's from 2015. It's 2019. If the negative can show any evidence that there's been retaliation, that demonstrates that they're able to pinpoint cyber attacks in a way that you're not able to resolve for because you don't get to defend a magical new kind of offensive operations which are less detectable.
And interest to retaliate. The third is sanctions. The United States has a sanctions program, which Nakashima 15 finds has been used more often to retaliate against cyber attacks. Fourth is adaptation. Countries can fix vulnerabilities in minutes. Even if a hostile nation wants to retaliate, they can't do any damage. Fifth is withholding. Cyber commanders continually hold on to their best cyber weapons so nobody knows the actual extent of what these cyber weapons can do. Sixth is politics. Good luck with an American government.
Retaliation doesn't hurt people? Like, come on. Terrorism isn't sophisticated. Right? Like, most of the terror attacks that have happened in the last few years have been, like, done with cars. Or in the United States, done with easily purchased firearms. I don't know. I don't like these answers.
It's politically impossible to pass retaliatory policy. As Rotor 15 finds, this is the reason why we haven't passed retaliatory strikes. 3 deterrents. First is deterrence. Operations deter hostile nations from fighting conflict because they don't want to be the target of the next strike. It's Golden 12 finds this is the reason deterrences work.
Not specific to cyber operations, but okay.
Second is preventing conventional warfare because Halo 19 finds that actors in the Middle East using cyber operations as an alternative to conventional wars, and it includes their being used as a de-escalatory deterrent. This is for these reasons. Black 16 finds there hasn't been any specific retaliatory attacks. On the link about shouting cooperation, their uniqueness takes it out. They say international cooperations are happening right now. It's better if the U.S. is at the table than if the U.S.
What are you doing?
It's better if the U.S. is at the table. Cooperation, their uniqueness takes it out. They say international cooperations are happening. Specific retaliatory attacks. On the link about shouting cooperation, Black 16 finds there hasn't been any specific reasons.
Okay, you have an argument from 16 that says there hasn't been any attacks, which I don't have the negative flowed, but if they have evidence from more recent than 16 that says there have been attacks, it's really difficult for your 2016 card to answer back the more recent, the post-dated card. Yeah, I thought that was, I think this debater is very talented. He's very skilled. I'm sure he's very smart. He's a smart dresser. I didn't care for that speech. I thought it didn't really demonstrate very good round vision. I don't think it really answered back the narrative of the negative. I think it had a bunch of arguments that either aren't like linking to what the negative's talking about, or just are easy to answer back with more recent evidence. And there was a lot of responses to things that the negative didn't really even say. With that said, I think the affirmative's case is still strong. But this is an interesting development because the negative's case hasn't really been touched, and that's going to give them a lot of preference in the judge's mind, I'm guessing. But let's find out.
They say international corporations are happening right now. It's better that the U.S. is at the table.
Kudos to Blue Water Bottle Boy for the time thing, and for the expressions. I live for that shit. Like the you're flowing, and then he's talking about nukes, and he go, like, that's a really, always do that. I mean, don't be rude, but a little ribbing like that is okay. I really went for like a cornflower blue thing. I like that. Matching pants. It's nice. It's nice. Okay, we're both just weighing.
That can cause a recession, but argument that the greatest.
Oh, their first
First weighing is that there are multiple reasons that can cause a recession, but argument that the greatest risk and the one that could cause the massive shock is going to be a cyber attack. Their second argument is that terror is intergenerational, it lasts for a long time. First, we say that you can't get out of a recession because of a stimulus package, because if your banks are shut down, there's no way to get out of a recession. It is still intergenerational. But secondly, we fundamentally change the economy of these countries and we're keeping them in recession. It's the same extent as a terror. Third, they say that there's like no advocates in these countries. We are still affecting the countries that don't have any advocates, where we're talking about an interconnected recession that affects everyone. Their fourth weighing is that it's prerequisite because of conflict. But a recession in Africa doesn't lead to a recession across the world, whereas you were targeting the pinpoint of the U.S. economy, which is the pinpoint of the rest of the economy, which means that our recession always outweighs there. Let's go to our first warrant here. They talk about defense. The biggest problem here is that they don't explain or contextualize how defense is important in the first place. They just span like 6 responses here, but never once tell you how defense is actually going to be stopping anything in the status quo. Group all of them together. First, it's about the idea about the perception. Even if our defensive measures are good right now, my point is to be proving to you how attacks are increasing right now. Secondly, we would say that if at the point where attacks are increasing, that means that every one of the reasons why they give you about defense being good right now is not true. Trillions of dollars are being taken out of the economy. Their advocacy is not working. They read a blip about nuclear weapons. We didn't talk about nuclear weapons. Let's go to their argument about Russia being cyber. This is non-responsive. Even if Russia fills in, we say that the only country that countries actually want to listen to is the United States, because the United States is the main norm setter. Group all 7 responses there, all 7 of like their things together.
The other responses were good.
Right now, these are
the idea that the United States is the norm setter, so if they stop cyber operations, nobody else is going to do this, is a weak argument. I mean, when you're talking about like offensive operations and terrorism, like, nobody's like, I don't know, does like the U.S. use machetes to like cut down the tall trees? Like, let's find out. Though, actually, if you, the greatest film ever made, I say that without exaggeration, the greatest thing ever filmed is the 2012 documentary, The Act of Killing. And in that, they go, like, they interview the people who conducted a genocide in Indonesia, and they were just, like, talking about, like, how inspired they were by, like, American gangster movies. It's pretty harrowing. So I don't know, maybe there is a point to that. Okay, this speech, I like it, mostly. I don't think that the most recent argument was solid, but what I worry about is that this speech is going to just try to respond to the speech before it and not actually tackle the affirmative's case. And given that most of what you're going to be saying about the first rebuttal is that it's not relevant, we're basically just ending up with a clean slate where it's the first constructive versus the second constructive, and I would have given the first constructive an advantage there. So you need to try to beat that advantage. You need to take an opportunity to start attacking that constructive and leave your constructive still unattacked. So let's see how he manages that time.
All hypothetical. If this were true, we'd see that attacks are going down right now. It's not the case right now. We're seeing trillions of dollars being taken out.
I really like that
They're
argument.
really mishandling this new uniqueness debate. On their turns, their first one is about deterrence. One, this is not contextualized at all.
Yeah.
They don't explain to what extent deterrence works. This was literally said in like 6 seconds. But secondly, we'd say they're not weighing this deterrence at all. We see that deterrence is always greater in a world in which really countries aren't afraid that we're about to strike them back. Their second argument is about an alternative to kinetic wars. This is not true. Once again, this is a link into their case. We see that drone strikes are increasing right now, which means clearly it's not an alternative to kinetic wars. We're going to be doing it no matter what. They say cooperation is happening right now. We say cooperation is not working right now because their agreements are being violated. On our impact level, they say our impact's not about a recession. It says a financial shock will happen pretty close.
But
to
also,
the
who
definition of
cares
recession.
if it's
Then
not
they
a
say that 900
recession?
million
If it links to the impacts. Like, oh no, a financial shock happens that destroys the economy. Vote on that.
people into poverty was based on like 2008 and not growth. Call for the evidence. It just says that if a major economic shock happens,
Right.
it'll push 900 million people into poverty. Let's go to their case. At the top level, the biggest thing that you need to be realizing is that they say that troops are decreasing right now, but that's not the case. Because what Holtwriter explains is that on balance, even though the troops are changing, they're just relocating the location of them. But on balance, troops are still increasing in the Middle East into other locations. At that point, they are not going to be proving any urgency here, and we're saying that no matter what, they're always going to have the check back of U.S. influence, which will always check back to there. But secondly, we'd say that if terrorism is going down to the status quo, it's not for the measures that they talk about. There's a bunch of other reasons, like A, international backlash, B, domestic crackdown, like Iraq is already shutting down 90% of terrorist accounts in the country. That means that there are always going to be other reasons why terrorists are going down. They're not going to be giving you any uniqueness to linking it into this argument about OCOs. Then on the idea with drone strikes. The biggest thing to realize, what Failure explains, is that drone strikes are increasing by
I think the
432%.
problem with introducing outside reasons why terrorism might be decreasing is that it disentangles the correlation between OCOs and terrorism, which, since OCOs and terrorism is what both sides are going for, doesn't help the narrative that OCOs increase terrorism. It hurts the narrative that OCOs decrease terrorism, but it doesn't help your OCOs increase terrorism, right? Like, you don't want to introduce too many alternate causes, because then it becomes really hard for you to tell a clear narrative. Now, you're saying, like, even if it's true that terrorism is decreasing, like, is it or is it not? Like, you need to know that. If your argument, if your case is that the increase in offensive cyber operations does more harm than good because it increases retaliation, but actually international terrorism is decreasing despite offensive cyber operations increasing, then you're in trouble. You've written a complicated narrative at best, right? I'm not saying that it can't be true. I'm just saying you've written a very complicated narrative that expects me to trust that terrorism's getting worse in some way beneath the surface of it actually getting better, right? So yeah, like, if your whole case is built around their increasing terrorism, you should have some terrorism is increasing card, and not give way to arguments like, even if it is decreasing. Seems like that hurts your narrative pretty badly.
The idea with drone strikes. The biggest thing to realize, what Failure explains, is that drone strikes are increasing by 432%. A couple of implications for this. A, it means that there's no trade-off like they talk about. Even if it's true that they become more efficient, it doesn't matter, because from the propaganda standpoint, all these other terrorist groups have to do is say, okay, drone strikes are increasing. It doesn't matter that they're decreasing in severity, even if they win that, because if on balance they're increasing, they say, oh, they've struck more bases, they've killed more people. On balance, it's still an increase. But they're still losing the severity debate, because what MRP explains, that civilian casualties due to drone strikes have doubled under Trump. They're literally losing this uniqueness debate pretty badly. Let's go specifically about terrorists going online. This is not true. What Thaddeus explains is that ISIS can't even start a cyber terrorist unit, because like the main recruiter and the main head of the ISIS cyber terrorist division has already been killed, which is why the ISIS cyber terrorism that they talk about in their case is not working at all right now. Specifically on the idea about Boko Haram, what seriously explains is that Boko Haram is rapidly increasing right now, and Nigeria is rapidly increasing. What the implication of this is that if offensive cyber operations were effective, we would say that the Boko Haram would no longer be a problem. They're painting a false narrative here. Let's go to the power grid.
Alright. Oh. Okay. I have to check. Excuse the interruption. I have to check if I have a round to judge. All right, fish, lion, mermaid, monsters. We're in the clear. Didn't get a round that round. Ballot. I don't know why I'm functioning at like 40% capacity today, but I feel that I earned it. Let's get back to here. That's probably, my face is probably covering it. This is, whatever. This is what Proteus looks like. The Greek, minor god from whom we take our name. That's not actually why we're named Proteus, but that's who Proteus is. Alright, let's go back to, where we were. Go a couple seconds back. This kid's doing a really good job. I think this is so far my favorite speech. I think he did a really good job listening to that speech and has very quickly come up with a lot of really good responses. So kudos to Blue Boy number 2.
Right now, specifically on the idea about Boko Haram, what seriously explains is that Boko Haram is rapidly increasing right now, and Nigeria is rapidly increasing. What the implication of this is that if offensive cyber operations were effective, we would say that the Boko Haram would no longer be a problem. They're painting a false narrative here. Let's go to the power grid argument. What Barrett explains is because that the U.S. power grid is decentralized, you can't attack it and take down the entire power. He explains you have to shut down all nine generators physically, and that would require an all-out war. That's not going to be happening there. Let's go specifically to their first impact about debts. We'd say that this impact about debts is going to be happening no matter what, because if you take away one terrorist group, another one will fill in. You don't solve for the root cause, which is economic inequalities. We link into this argument. Their second argument, economic growth. First, even if you take out terrorism, there's other reasons that make it a bad climate for investment, such as like political uncertainty and the fact that their economies are run primarily on resource extraction. On their third impact about political stability, we would say that elections aren't bad because like there's terrorists there. Elections are bad because the U.S. forced elections at a point when there's literally civil wars going down, and like neo-imperial elitists forced elections to happen when they weren't ready. No matter what, elections are going to be in a pretty bad situation in those countries, and nothing's going to change.
This kid's pretty quick about pointing out when people are over time, given that he was like 10 seconds over time. Alright. What's happening here? Is this prep? They're calling for a card? Yeah, they called for a card.
Okay, so why do politicians use drones?
They don't.
Why do they use drones? Because they like them.
Or why do they like them?
It's like a way for them to attack other nations.
So, like, would it be fair to say that the reason, like, Republican politicians specifically like to use drones is because they want to look strong on terror without putting U.S. soldiers in harm's way?
No, I feel like we'd use drone strikes no matter what.
I'm not saying that the answer is no. I'm saying is if your opponent is asking, would it be fair to say blank? Just say no. It's not going to hurt you. Might not help them.
Soldiers in harm's way.
No, I feel like we'd use drone strikes no matter what. It's like Trump
Yeah,
is
no,
repeatedly...
that's completely our argument, right? So
Okay, yeah. So I'm saying that drone strikes are still increasing right now. So insofar as we are using drone strikes no matter what, it doesn't matter that they're becoming more efficient. Because to the point of the
more people are dying. What do you mean why?
Say is okay. The U.S. is still increasing drone strikes. They bombed 40 different locations. Who cares if they bombed 40 different locations and 5% less people died? It matters about the fact that they're still bombing more locations and still giving them a reason to lash out.
Sure, I understand that, right? But you're painting a false dichotomy with the comparative. In a world without OCOs, you would still have the exact same number of drone strikes from Trump. They would just be less effective. So you're telling me the effectiveness doesn't matter at all.
Well, I'm telling you that if your argument was true, we wouldn't see that civilian casualties due to drone strikes have doubled since Trump.
No. The reason it's doubled since Trump is because Trump is a Republican president that increased drone strikes and would have done it in either world. Clearly, right? Wait, didn't start the timer. Okay, we'll just go to that.
Yeah, that's a pretty good argument from the affirmative that, you know, drone strikes would have increased anyway. Be great to have a card for it, but also just like... Did I hit record? Am I recording this? Whoops. That's the last video. What? Is this it? Okay, great. I'm recording this. Oh my lord, I'm lost. Okay. That's pretty good. It just doesn't disrupt their So, okay, if your argument is like, oh, this is going to kill fewer civilians, then great, you can have that impact. But that's not your impact. Your impact is that this is then going to create less resentment, which, I mean, no, it's not. Right? Like, the people who are getting drone striked don't have a perspective of, right, but if it wasn't for those offensive cyber operations, they would actually be killing even more. So it doesn't matter that the number of people in my country that are dying is increasing. What matters to me is that it's not increasing at the rate that it would be if they weren't also hacking us in some other ways. So now I'm not mad at the United States. Not a good link scenario.
Yeah, the point that I think you're missing here is that, yeah, we can agree that drone strikes are increasing no matter what. The point I'm trying to make is it's not as, like, complicated, and it can't be as convoluted from the perspective of, like, for example, a terrorist group saying, okay, guys, listen up, here we go. They've increased by 432%. Trust me, there's been like a 0.57% decrease in civilian casualties. Let's just, like, there's no more anti-American sentiment.
This kid is good at debate. And if he's, like, teaching a camp somewhere, you should go pay that child, who's now probably not a child. 2019, he might still be a child. Blue boy number 2, give him money.
So far as we are drone striking at an increased rate every single year, no matter how better offensive operations make the drone strikes, they're still going to be using anti-American sentiment.
Let me just understand your argument so Ash will get front line. You're saying that yes, drones get more effective. We're just going to launch a lot of drone strikes.
They're not getting more effective.
So what is your response to why they don't get more effective?
What do you mean? Like, why they don't get more effective? Because it doesn't matter if individual drone strikes like have a small likelihood of being more effective. Because in reality, when you're drone striking areas, they're still going to be hurting people. Like, they're not becoming more effective.
So your argument is that the individual drone strikes get more effective, but the rest of the overall
nothing becomes more effective. I'm not conceding any part of your case if that's what you want me to do. Let me ask you a question. Okay, so let's get specifically about your idea about, like, economic growth. To what extent is terrorism limiting FDI?
We say that, like, a 1 standard deviation, we show the evidence, a 1 standard increase in terrorist attacks leads to, like, a 7% decrease in foreign direct investment.
Okay, but even if, like, for example, terrorism was not there, but aren't there other, like, reasons why investment wouldn't be there? Like, you have that study, but I'm asking you from the warrants perspective, even if you take away terrorism, there's still civil instability, there's still the fact that their economy is based off, like, taking, like,
that's
gold out of the mine.
Sure, that's, like, a real oversimplification of how, like, economics works. Obviously, if there's less terrorism, some investors are going to come back.
To what extent is it going to get better?
Well, we give you evidence that
says... You're going to say that if we eliminate terrorism, there'll be, like, a 7% increase in...
Not eliminate terrorism, just, like, 1 standard deviation decrease in the number of terrorist attacks.
Okay, so have terrorist attacks gone down in Africa?
Yes, and that's
how come Boko Haram has
gone up.
FDI has gone up in Africa. You
yes.
evidence saying FDI has gone up.
Yes.
So what has happened as a result of that?
Development, like...
Yeah, Africa's, like, what happened in development? Like,
all right, well, you're...
It says Africa has seen an increase in FDI
the point I'm trying to make is that, like, even if there's, like, a little bit increase in terrorism...
Thank you, person sitting in a camera. Yeah, I don't know. That you're reaching there with the, like, oh, they did receive foreign direct investment? Like, what happened? It's like, I don't know, more people ate? Fewer people were hungry? It's shaping up to be a pretty good debate. Share all your cards from the beginning so I don't have to skip through the stuff. If I was in person, I'd just depersonalize and stare at the patterns on the... Oh my lord!
So we're going to start on the AF case.
Word. AF case weighing the neg case? What?
Start at the...
So you're making extensions, and then you're going to weigh those as being the most important things in the round, and then you're going to answer the neg case? Okay, let's see it.
Then go to weighing, then the neg case. Everyone did? Start at the top of our flow. They say in response to U.S. pullout that troops have simply been relocated. We look at their evidence. It's not about the Middle East, not about regions struck by terrorism. It's the Persian Gulf. We'd say they're not going to be combating terrorism. But second, their own evidence says to us that this pullout.
Come on. I don't like when debate
regions,
partners do the move on thing unsolicited. It doesn't help. It's never helped.
But second, their own evidence says to us that this pullout from Trump
it just discredits your partner. It just makes your partner look like they're doing a bad job. You don't want to look like you think your partner is doing a bad job. You want to look like you think your partner is the shit. And they're giving a speech so good that anybody who doesn't like it isn't good at debate. You want to be hyping up your partner. That's a video we made like the week we launched the channel.
Region struck by terrorism, it's the Persian Gulf. We'd say they're not going to be combating terrorism. But second, their own evidence says to us that this pullout from Trump in these regions is ultimately going to lead to an ISIS resurgence. We say you call for it. It's really bad. But then second, they say there are other ways of stopping terrorism.
If you're telling me to call for a card because it's bad, but you're not telling me why it's bad or why what's wrong with the card or why it's not a good link, no. I got shit to do. It's probably 8 o'clock. What is this, Octos? I don't know, probably not 8 o'clock, but I probably have places I'm trying to be, and I'm not going to do that unless you give me a good reason to. So, not a great takeout of that link.
From Trump in these regions is ultimately going to lead to an ISIS resurgence. We say you call for it. It's really bad. But then second, they say there are other ways of stopping terrorism. One, their own evidence says that this U.S. pullout is ultimately going to lead to a resurgence. We'd say you buy their evidence there, and that ultimately flows af. But then on Africa, this goes cold conceded. They simply say that Boko Haram has increased. But since they don't respond to our actual link, we'd say that ultimately it would have been a lot worse in their world without offensive cyber operations through this tech transfer, which ultimately means that Africa would have been less able to combat terror, ultimately meaning Boko Haram.
But we have no way to measure that, is the problem. You're not giving us any metrics. You're asking us to vote affirmative on the premise that it decreases something, but you don't have any decrease to point to. It's just a decrease compared to some rate of something that would have been worse. But, if you have those statistics and you have that, metric, just tell me that, right? Terror was increasing, terror attacks were increasing at this rate. We increased offensive cyber operations. Now they are increasing at this much lower rate. But you're not saying that. All you're saying is, hey, the fact that the links were tested and the results that we see aren't indicating solvency does not actually mean we don't have solvency, which might be true, but then you're not giving me anything more.
Completely drop funding. What this means is a couple things. In the long term, terrorists won't have the money to actually perform these terror attacks. This is a long-term solution. But second, in response to this idea of other terrorists, even if one group shuts down, there's simply a fill-in. We'd say as long as we shut down their funding while they're still small, there is a long-term solution. That means we're ultimately the only side that has any chance of solving for terrorism because their own.
One argument that they should have been, should in the, second speech or whatever, maybe even just here talk about I talked about terrorism isn't complicated. Terrorism might not be complicated, but it is expensive. You don't think about this, but the 9/11 attacks cost millions of dollars to perpetrate. Is that a word? People had to be put through flight school. I think the funding argument is good. I just think you don't have enough explanation in the case. You've gone for too many things and you didn't have some very strong links to most of it. If you would just focus more on the funding and how without a functioning funding mechanism, despite any motivation to commit terror acts, these organizations are significantly defanged, so to speak. So I think the argument there is fine. I just don't see it winning this round because you haven't really terminalized that.
But now into the impacts. A couple ways you can be voting for us. Like on their point on death, they simply say that others feel like we've responded to that.
You
Second,
gotta
on
tell me
economics,
what
they say
you
that the reason
said.
why,
Like, you are taking me to some random part of the flow, right? And you have to assume I'm looking at the flow. And so you're like, okay, now let's go to, like, weighing. Okay, where am I looking on my flow right now? Like, am I flowing this? Am I flowing it on a new sheet? Am I flowing it at a specific place? Are you going to tell me where to look? So you're like, okay, let's go to the whatever. It's like, they said this. All right. And we responded to it. And I'm like, do I have to, like, look through my flow and find that before I know I believe you? This is also why you, in debate formats where you make a, like, let's say parlay, and you're doing, like, the LO speech, the first negative speech, where you give your constructive and you respond to the opponents. You always go off case first with your constructive of your negative stuff, because otherwise what'll end up happening is you will be like, hey, they say this, and that's wrong, but we're going to tell you later why. We're going to outweigh this with an argument that we're going to make later. And then you get to that argument, but the problem is that you're just not getting me to write the correct thing in the right part of my flow. A flow is an argument map. And what that means is that I should be able to look at my flow and understand which arguments are in play, which arguments are not in play. And that is why it's important for you to get me to write the correct thing on the correct spot on my flow, because I'm not going to look through my entire flow to reread the debate before I make a decision, especially if my flow is on several different sheets, as it's probably optimal to do. What you want is for me at the end of the debate to have my focus on the argument you want me to focus on, and then be like, okay, like, do these things get across? Like, yes, they do. Okay, great. Or, oh, the negative asked me to look here, but the F's right. These arguments were answered. And when you're kind of, like, off the grid like this, you're making for a messy flow.
The economy is bad is because of political uncertainty. We tell you we
Especially
solve
when
that.
you're not,
Let's get
like,
to our third impact about political.
Don't just say we answered that. Tell me how you answered it.
Stability. They say that, like, the United States forces these elections, but we specifically tell you the United States protected elections in Nigeria against Boko Haram, improving their democracy. We say that's critical for two reasons. One, it means that these democratic nations are less likely to go to conflict because their leaders are more rational, and two, it ultimately means that they're, like, it increases investor confidence, benefiting the economy, like our second impact. But now to the weighing. We'd say that we're the only form of solvency for terror is OCOs. They say that there's, like, the greatest risk of recession, like, the comparative is that, like, that it's because of a cyber attack. We'd say recessions are cyclical and stimulus is always possible. These banks only shut
You're
down.
not answering the argument that the things that shut down the... I don't know why they're temporary, and I don't know how a stimulus helps. That's been answered. You're not addressing it.
The outside forces, like intervening factors, are always going to create this stimulus for the United States because they have a vested interest in them.
So another country is going to create a bailout for U.S. banks?
Then you vote for us on time frame because terrorism is happening right now. All these bank collapses aren't. But second, we'd say that terrorism is also intergenerational. This bank collapse is temporary, whereas everything
you know
else
what's famously not intergenerational, apparently? Poverty.
Unless you intervene, like, on these issues. But then onto this point about, like, no advocates. They simply say that they solve for, like, countries because they have, like, weak economies. We'd say, no, that's not true. You have to solve for intent. We'd say the only way to do so is to solve back for terror. And then also...
problem. You're saying the only way to solve back is to solve back for intent, and I'm assuming you're talking about the terror argument there, but you're just not winning that link because of what the Blue Boy 2 said during Cross-X, right? I'm just not buying this link scenario where in a post-OCO world, anybody's like, you know what? The U.S. has really changed. I was mad for a while, but ever since they shut down our power grid, I've started to think about how it could be worse. And I do like those Marvel movies, so let's chill out for a little bit.
Ability increases conflict in the long term. The only way to solve this is by getting rid of terrorist groups and having more democratic elections. Now to their flow. They completely mishandled this offense versus defense overview that Siva reads to you. One, we'd say it doesn't matter if attacks are occurring as long as, one, offensive operations take out opponent offensive operations, taking away the need for defense. Two, it solves for vulnerabilities in our defense, meaning even if they attack, we're still prepared. And three, it takes out conventional means, which ultimately is going to be better for us, because then that means we can combat
How can
all
you
the
say
issues. They completely
it doesn't matter if terror attacks are occurring if offensive operations are taking out the ability for attacks to happen? If the attacks are happening, then that demonstrates you haven't taken out the ability for attacks to happen.
dropped the non-unique on Russia, which says that this development would have happened no matter what. Ultimately, this flows af, because when this occurs, every impact they talk about is going to happen regardless, because people are still going to build up cyber arms. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's still spots on the flow where the AF can take it, but they just haven't been doing the work, right? The topic and the advocacy of the affirmative has room to win against the grounds and specific advocacy here of the negative, but they just don't really seem to have much round vision. Their responses haven't really been that on point. At this point, that's something I talk about a lot. Judges look for reasons to vote for the team that they want to win. And they can't help it. They're just human beings. This is the way it works. So at this point, I want the negative to win. I like how they debate. I like the arguments. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for an argument coming from the negative that seems important enough to win the round. And I'm going to wait for them to emphasize that. Once that's happened, I have my argument that I'm going to be like, cool, that's where I'm going to look to. It seems important enough to vote on. And then it's going to be on the affirmative to make it not possible for me to vote on that. If they can make it not possible for me to vote on that, then awesome. But if otherwise, that's probably how I'm going to vote. And that's oftentimes how my decision will get made. And that's probably not the way I'll phrase it when I'm doing my feedback or disclosure or RFD or whatever. But that's my thought process, if I'm being honest. And that's probably how many judges think. All right.
So the order is going to be addressing their weighing our case areas. Sound good? Start with the weight. We first gave you this uniqueness weight, and saying that recessions happen all the time, but terrorism is specifically unique. But we tell the Goldsmith evidence that cyber recession is worse than a normal recession, which is why it's going to be a lot worse in our world, because you can't access the banks, you can't access the stimulus package to get back out. But then on time frame, they say that offensive operations will have cause a recession. But we say that A, offensive operations have only increased a lot recently, but B, we're on the brink of a recession happening in the very near future, at the point where trillions of dollars being taken out of the economy. Beyond that, they try to make the argument that terrorism is intergenerational. We'd say without a stimulus, a recession will last for a very long time, meaning that poverty from a recession will be intergenerational as well. But then they say that no advocates for victims of terrorism. We'd say that a recession affects everyone across the world, is interconnected to the global economy, which means that we're still going to be impacting the countries that don't have advocates. And then beyond that, they try to extend that prerequisite, but we'd say that conflict still exists. This it doesn't really respond. But then extend our argument where we tell you the state-sponsored attacks are increasing, with trillions of dollars being lost in the global economy, and America's use of offensive operations causes a hack through our first link by retaliation. We tell you that Trump's increased use of offensive operations caused distorted cyberspace, catalyzing fear and escalation, and leads to retaliation from a bunch of different actors, We tell you the specific example that Jin gives you, that when we hacked Iran responded by hacking 46 banks, and we tell you that this argument is true because Valeriano finds there's limited retaliation before 2016 when Obama regulated offensive operations.
Okay, so that's not exactly the framing that I wanted there. I wanted you to read examples that post-date their card, but you kind of just did, right? And given that this is the team that I want to vote for, I'll find ways of connecting dots for them, right? The negative tells me that retaliations can't happen because people don't know, blah, blah, blah. But their card that says is talking about these retaliations specifically says it wasn't as bad before 2016, which to me tells me that the 2015 and 16 cards that talk about how retaliations don't happen is talking about the Obama era where retaliations weren't happening at a large scale and not the Trump era where they have been. And that indicates to me that there probably is some mechanism for people to know to attack the United States. So at this point, I'm buying a link into retaliatory attacks, which is, if what they're going for, probably something I could vote on.
Because due to global interconnectedness, shutting down one bank could lead to a widespread recession, pushing 900 million people into poverty. They have a couple of responses. First, in the overview, they said that offensive operations are good for shutting down stuff, but you can just group these responses to the point where attacks are still increasing right now. You're not showing to any extent how we're shutting down other countries' offensive operations. This just isn't true. Beyond that, they say they try to bluntly extend that we take out conventional means.
Yeah,
we have no
that's a good takeout, right? Again, it's the links have been tested, right? We're doing offensive operations right now, and we still are getting attacked, right? In concept, offense might be a good defense, but in practice, we're not taking out their ability to launch offensive operations because offensive operations are happening. So, again, pretty good work through that ink from the affirmative. The negative is doing good work. We said drone strikes are increasing affirmatives
rapidly right now. But beyond that, they try to extend this Russia developing starting an arms race through ink. We just saying we drop it doesn't mean we actually drop it. We see the US is the main norm setter, and they're the main ones who constantly spurring the development
not a good
of
argument.
Arms all across the country. A couple reasons why we prefer this argument. The first, which is on prerequisite, we tell you that poor economic conditions are the root of instability, which breeds terror, means that terrorism is always going to be worse in a world where there's a recession. So, our argument always comes before theirs. And then on scope, we impact to every country around the world.
Okay, but
Africa and wherever ISIS is.
I don't know. That story's a little complicated. I mean, it's just the problem of applying generics to generics to generics, right? When you actually sit down to explain the story, you're telling me, okay, so what's going to happen is Boko Haram is going to successfully attack the United States, triggering a global recession, which will then upset Boko Haram because now they're poor and they're going to do what? They're going to attack the United States for causing poverty. I know that's not the actual scenario. It's probably this creates inequality and economic troubles in other places, which radicalizes people and causes people to do whatever, right? But I can definitely spin it the other way and be so you're telling me that a successful Boko Haram attack is going to hurt Boko Haram so much that they're going to be angry at whoever caused the problem? Are they going to attack themselves? So I think the arms race stuff is not going well for the negative. I think the retaliation stuff probably is going fine. I think what the affirmative is going to have to do is argue that, look, these attacks from other countries will happen no matter what. Even if the United States begins to de-escalate now, it's too late. You can't stop it. That's what I've been saying from the start, but I haven't really heard that from the affirmative. Maybe they'll go for it. I don't know.
And then beyond the ways of the authoritarianism always increases in times of political and financial instability. Look at Germany in the aftermath of World War I, when Hitler and the Nazi Party took rise and preying off a financial instability that was there as a result. If you buy the political instability and democracy is a really good thing, it goes down to their world. But a couple reasons why their arguments don't really apply. The first of which is on this argument of troops, we'd say that the troops are increasing in places across the world, solving back for it. They say our arguments our evidence is really bad, but the evidence still says that the troops are still increasing, regardless of the good or bad. That's what's happening historically. They can't prove to you otherwise. But beyond that, we'd say the effects of terrorism are still increasing right now. Look to Boko Haram, whose attacks and the deaths caused by Boko Haram are increasing in the status quo. They just say that tech transfer solved back, but A, they don't explain to what extent it solved back. B, they don't warrant to how tech transfer solved back. This isn't extended in summary at all. And C, they're saying no, not contextualizing around. And then beyond that, on the impact, they just talk about this idea of funding. We say they just turn to other things oil, ransom, and espionage. And beyond that, they don't contextualize to what extent funding is important for terrorism. We just say if we should overall our case solves that better.
You have a question?
Okay. So, talking about this idea about funding, so I'm just confused. How does Office of Cyber Operations shut down all the forms of funding that they use?
This is kind of late to respond, but basically the argument is just they take out banks and they take out they freeze ISIS's assets. That was the case. It wasn't a little.
Okay, that's fine.
So it's their means of acquiring
the point we're trying to make is that what if you freeze one?
They're not going to pay people in buckets of oil.
Then you can freeze that.
Yeah, we freeze their we freeze their financial assets. So
their financial assets are so diversified. How do you stop everything?
Right. So that's our point. Right now in the status quo, you can't solve it because they're diversified. Targeted cyber operations because they're all directed to a central.
How do you stop the diversification?
I really think that you can't respond to Grant Cross's argument.
If you don't want to defend your warrant, you don't have to. But I'm just talking about the idea that it's just the general idea that we literally almost destroyed terrorism in the past. And they just keep popping back.
I understand. So
we have had. Wait, hold it. I just want to clarify. This is not necessarily a new response because we read the argument about how you don't solve for the root of terrorism. So insofar as there are economic inequalities, a new one will come in.
Yeah. Okay. No. Okay. So here. The first thing you said was about the way it was contextualized in the second summary is that they can shift to oil and other resources. The problem is when you're selling, hold on, let me finish, right? When you're selling oil, you still have to put the money into your banks to use it, right? So you're still going to use the banks with freezing assets and all that.
You don't need a bank.
Second, you talk about what was the second thing you said? We don't solve for the root cause of poverty and inequality,
because there have been poor economic conditions in these places all the time. Their finances have not always been insured, but they still come back.
I understand. So it's kind of a cart before the horse scenario, right? You need to spur economic development. So the perceptual link we read in case about investor confidence increasing.
So you rely on your second. You have to win your second impact in order for you to win your link. That's
not an argument, right? Your response to why the root of the impact that was on the impact level where you responded, right?
No.
We still decrease terrorism to some extent because we take out their capacity. Right?
No, our response is that even if you take out their capacity in this way, they've had their capacity taken out in the past, and they just come back because the root of the problem is economic inequalities. So if one group gets eliminated, another one will.
Okay,
come in. That's the
point. No, our argument is that.
Then you need to take out the foreign investment argument, right? You're saying you're not solving for terrorism because you're not solving the root economic inequalities. What the AF is saying is, by solving for terrorism, what we're able to do is increase investment to reduce economic inequality. And so then the argument isn't about economic inequality, right? It's can you decrease terrorism? Because if they decrease terrorism, you can't say you don't have long-term solvency because you're not reducing the motivation for terrorism because they have the foreign direct investment. You ask them, do you have that? Is that happening in Africa? And they're like, yes. And then you just backed away from it, right? So you can't use that as the solvency takeout because they already have that. They have that very plainly stated. If we can reduce terror attacks, we will long-term improve the economic conditions. So you just need to take out the part that says we reduce terror attacks. You can't be like, you're not able to long-term keep terror attacks down because you're not solving economic conditions. It seems like they are.
The short-term effects of you taking out their capacity means investors come back. That solves for your impact about poverty in the long term, which links back in. I say feedback.
No.
when economic growth
because even if in the short term investors come back and they're like, okay, terrorists are gone for like a few days. If they come back in the long term, they're going to go away.
But will those investors be decreasing poverty, and thus decreasing the incentives for people to, like, what in your world? What does the decrease of the motivations behind terrorism actually look like? And why does improving the economic conditions of a country not satisfy that model?
Okay,
Yeah,
okay, I'll take the question. So you guys talk about this stuff about like how defense straight off the read at the top doesn't apply because attacks are increasing now.
Yep.
And we're kind of confused as to
So your argument,
why
right?
you never read a card to pinpoint like the reason the attacks are increasing is because our
That's
defense
not
is
the
bad
point.
or our
Well, no,
offense is
your
bad.
argument here is that offensive operations mean that other, like, it takes out the opponent's, like, adversaries, like, capabilities and, like, ability to attack, right?
No, so our argument
That's your argument.
No, that is, but our argument's like a bit broader. I think you're kind of like misinterpreting. What we're saying basically is in a world without offensive cyber operations, our defenses will be much worse, which means your impact would be
No, because
massive.
we read the Valerino evidence, which explains that before 2016, escalation was not a thing, so that takes out their response as well.
He's going to start on the weighing we did, and the weighing in his summary, and our case, their case. Is everyone good? Let's start on the weighing debate. Their response to our uniqueness evidence is that Trump has been pulling out troops, and that they're this recession, particularly through cyber attacks, is a lot worse. They promise they don't contextualize how much worse it gets because of cyber attacks. We would say fundamentally, recessions and bad times of economic growth are always going to happen. Which is always going to increase. The only chance you have to solve back for it is through like economic growth. Is through terrorism in these developing countries, which they concede are more important.
I
because they
don't
have
buy
the time frame weighing is
that
also
the foreign investment in Nigeria is going to counteract the impact of a global recession. So I'm not going to take that argument into consideration for either side.
dropped. What they tell you is that increased use of retaliation. But the problem is, what we tell you is that specifically terrorism is happening right now. You're seeing a decrease in terrorism right now because of the increased use in offensive cyber operations. That means you have the biggest probability around because you're always evaluating.
Am I seeing a decrease in terrorism? Has that card been read? And is it because of... We'll see.
On the prerequisite weighing.
Is that the uniqueness argument he was reading? I don't know. This round might have helped the flow, but
They say it doesn't matter because a recession affects the entire world. The problem is this analysis is once again taken out by the non-unique. Recessions will always happen to some extent, which means at bad times economic growth always going to happen. The only way you fundamentally change Africa's economy is by spurring economic growth.
I don't buy that argument because it's just not responsive to all of the specific analysis they read about recessions may happen all the time or whatever, but these kinds of recessions cannot be... Your argument of we always get out just doesn't apply because you don't have a mechanism that solves for this specific kind of recession. I'm not saying that we won't get out, I'm just saying you haven't given me that reason.
Do that is by decreasing terrorism. Let's go.
And again, your link here is decreasing terrorism, which I don't buy the decreasing the motivation for terror argument. Now, maybe you have a card that says terrorism is decreasing. I'd be curious what that card says as the reason why it's decreasing.
It's a prereq because economic growth is the root cause of terrorism. Sure, economic growth may be the root cause of terrorism, but if you solve for the impacts of terrorism in the short term, you still spur economic growth in the short term, which means you're pulling Africa out, which means in the long term, their impacts don't materialize because less people are turning to terrorism. The second thing they say is that authoritarianism goes up, but we give you specific evidence to how this is going to change in our world because the U.S. is able to protect elections. This evidence goes clean dropped in summary, which means you're extending our election war from VAVR, which indicates that the U.S. is able to protect elections through offensive cyber operations because Boko Haram has been trying to take down elections. This increases political stability and increases investor confidence, because when you have more democratic leaders, investors are more confident in their rational incentives and they're not going to go to conflict. The second thing they drop is our argument about tech transfers. What they say, the only thing they say is that we don't contextualize what tech transfers are. We contextualize it very specifically. The only line of evidence indicates that Nigeria and the U.S. are collaborating through offensive cyber operations. And what this indicates from sales is that it decreases capabilities in terms of funding from these terrorist groups. When you take out the funding that these terrorist groups have, you take out their capacity, which links in immediately to our impacts about economic stability, economic growth. A 1 standard deviation decrease in terrorism leads to a 7% increase in foreign direct investment, which spurs Africa's growth to the point where 400 million people are pulled out of poverty, linking back into the terrorism argument, creating a feedback loop where terrorism is solved.
So this was an interesting round. I know it's not over, but that was a good speech. I think what happened in this round, at the end of the day, was that the affirmative had a better case than the negative, but the affirmative mishandled the first rebuttal. I think they've pretty successfully dug themselves out, and by dug themselves out, I just mean leveraged their case against the negative, because they just have a pretty solid link scenario with good impacts, right? It is a good round in that sense, in terms of like, well, it's exciting, this back and forth. So I can see myself voting for the AF based on that speech. Let's see what the negative has to say. This is not one of those cases where I'm decided immediately and I already know. And it also goes to show that like close debate rounds usually indicate something being mishandled. Like when a decision is difficult for a judge to make, that does not mean both teams did a really, really good job. That means stuff went wrong, because good debates lead to clear decision making. Like judges feeling they have clarity and confidence in their decision is what you want to instill. The debaters can be excellent on both sides, and the clash can be really good, but if it's a good, clean debate, then a judge should be able to still, with confidence, decide what is the most important issue, what are the link scenarios that lead to that, and do they buy the steps along the way. That's why novice rounds are harder to make decisions about as a judge than open rounds. Not that I'm comparing this to a novice round. Just that the fact that it is difficult speaks to what I consider to be mistakes made by both sides rather than accomplishments of each side.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Similar order to summary, talking about the overview, our case, weighing, and mitigation. Is everyone good? Okay. On the overview, saying we dropped it does not mean that we actually dropped it. We have frontlined every single response they made. The first thing that they talk about a recession being inevitable. Goldsmith tells you that the recession due to a cyber recession would be way worse than the inevitable one because it's harder to get out of the recession, which means that fundamentally it will still be a worse recession in their world. Then they try to argue this argument about how terrorism is intergenerational. Once again, they're just dropping what we were saying. We say that the recession will still be intergenerational if you can't get out of the recession. But at the end of the day, these are just reasons why terrorism is more important than recession. If we can still prove that the recession links into terrorism, we are still winning the round. Let's talk about how we are doing that. First, our argument is that recessions, the economic attacks on banks are increasing right now, with 23 attacks done in the last few years, according to Moon, taking trillions of dollars out of our global economy. We are winning through our first warning about retaliation, where Ballerino tells you that Trump has distorted the rules of cyberspace and have catalyzed fear and escalation. You know this is true because Jin tells you that when we hacked Iran, they responded with hacks on 46 different banks, and Ballerino explains that this was not the case before 2016, which takes out most of their overview in the first place. On the recession argument, Bassani explains that due to global interconnectedness, one bank going down could lead to a financial shock across the world, which the IMF tells you pushes 900 million people into poverty. They just keep extending this idea about this like defensive overview, but our argument is that it doesn't matter about this defensive overview because fundamentally, even if it was true that defense helps a little bit, we still say that trillions of dollars are being taken out of the economy, which is still a reason why their advocacy is not working the status quo. On the Wang debate, here's where we're winning the round. The first one is on the idea that the prerequisite and that economic inequalities are the roots cause of terrorism, which my opponents agree with. Then they try to respond to this by saying that they cause a short-term boost in economic growth. This is a reason for you to sign your ballot for the negative ballot, or for the negative side, because they are saying that they're only a short-term solution. We are a longer-term solution because if you lead to an intergenerational recession that gets solved afterward versus just a short-term boost in FDI, we still affect more countries that have terrorism. But the third form of reign, which is authoritarianism, is even more important because they mishandle this. They just say in response to this, the Boko Haram stuff, our argument is that if you spread economic inequalities across the world, authoritarianism spreads across the world, which destroys their political stability, destroys their economic response, and at that point the round is so clean because we affect more countries than they do. But specifically on their argument about the funding, they just dropped Oshman's response from summary when we said that they'll turn to other funding sources. They just didn't respond to it, and they just at that point their argument's probably not true.
Yeah, that wasn't a good ending. What? Okay, so do I believe that the affirmative is spreading economic inequality throughout the world? No, because the argument that their operations are creating incentives for foreign direct investments is pretty clean. So then the only scenario left for me to consider as the judge, right, is, okay, I believe that what the affirmative is accomplishing is a gradual decrease in terrorism. Not for a lack of them, being upset with the United States, but through a lack of the funding mechanisms they need for terror attacks and the actual other direct means they need for attacks, and in the long term by creating more economic equality, which will, or improving the economies of those places, which will disincentivize people wanting to resort to extremism and so on. The only question left is, while all of that all of those scenarios are happening gradually, will some sort of catastrophic attack on the United States happen, right? Terrorism can decrease in the overall trend and one attack still happen. And that attack will then collapse the U.S. economic system, which creates a ripple effect across the entire world economy, undoing all of those benefits, increasing terrorism, and all of that. I don't think either Final Focus speaker did a good enough job of understanding that that's what's in controversy right now. This is what the round comes down to. And if there is a pretty wide split, it'll be because of that. Because I don't think they did a good enough job where advocating for their side. In the scenario that I buy, there is a gradual improvement. How do I make my decision as the judge in a world where there is a gradual trend towards economic and political stability in places like Nigeria, with a risk of some percent, I don't know, with a risk that at any moment everything could get worse. I think ultimately the negative doesn't bother quantifying that risk, right? They say any risk that this could one day happen is enough to trigger this. And this is kind of where they're just leaving it up to the judges, right? Because it's up for me to decide, do I believe that scenario will happen within the time frame? And I can easily see a judge being well, you've left it open that this thing could happen and that could reverse all the blah, blah, blah. Or I think that attack probably won't happen, and if it does happen, it probably won't be that bad, and that this is the only solution. Yeah, I think both teams overall did pretty good. They're very talented, but I think I'm left with a very unclean decision, which would oftentimes prompt me to vote for, well, there's really no presumption in in public forum debate. I think the most damning thing that happens in this round, and I don't really hear this evidence like explained or outlined or touched upon, but the negative concedes it directly. They say, even if terrorism is decreasing in the status quo, and I can't get over that. I don't see why you would agree with that. But in a world where you do, and I believe that terrorism is decreasing in the status quo, then that severely hurts the entire premise behind the negative. So that's my decision. I'm not happy about it, and I feel like if I was giving this RFD in a round, one of these debaters would be like, how do you feel about this argument? And blah, blah, blah. And I'll have to be like, hey, man, I don't know what to tell you. If my decision is shitty, it's because you didn't give me a clean place to vote. And I'm not going to bend over backwards to make the debate clean for these four debaters. But great round. Good suggestion. So that's how I vote. Let's see how things panned out. Picked up on a 2-1. Yeah. Split decision, probably in favor of the affirmative. So I don't know what the controversy here was exactly. Let's go back here. There's a lot of controversy over the decision. Yeah, because it's the debater's fault. And different debate philosophies. Great. Who adapted? Maybe. I don't know what the judge is. Blah, blah, blah. But yeah, like I said, there's easy ways to justify voting for either side. For me, it's who deserves to be punished. Right? Like, who did things in this debate? Who made the most mistakes? Who deserves to lose? Oh my god, I look like a wild man. Ow, just pulled out like a lot of hair. Okay. Hold on, let me deal with this lag. So yeah, I think part of the way I make my decision in a situation like this, as I'm waiting for... Are we there? No? Yes? Okay, seems pretty good. Seems good. I'm going to try to figure out a better camera situation. Part of the way I make my decision in scenarios like this happens to speech too, if it's a speech round where it's a tough decision. It's like, okay, who deserves to be rewarded? Who deserves to be punished? And yeah, the second the AF rebuttal speech wasn't the best, but it didn't just make a bunch of concessions that like directly hurt their side. In a world where terrorism is decreasing, the neg doesn't have much ground to stand on. So either the AF is just factually true, in which case no reason not to vote AF, or the negative mishandled it and terrorism isn't decreasing, but they for whatever reason allowed that to be the narrative in this round, in which case they don't deserve to win. So that's my decision. Hopefully brought a little bit of clarity to that round, though maybe not a lot of it. Goodbye for now.